finally here, the 2025 EBRC White Paper. Let's take a look together. Just as a recap, this Electoral Boundaries Review Committee is convened by the Prime Minister and consists of civil servants and is chaired by the Secretary to the Prime Minister. In this report, they recommended boundaries for SMCs and GRCs for the coming 2025 general election. So you might have seen this in the news already, but they are introducing pretty sweeping changes for the 2025 election. You can see these bits in white. That's about 5 districts that remain unchanged this year. On the other hand, we have these green sections which represent new constituencies and these blue sections that represent changed constituencies. On the other hand, you can see how much they changed in 2020 from the 2015 elections. One notable change we see is with SMCs. We have about 5 SMCs that are removed and 6 that are introduced. We got rid of Yuhua, Bukit Batok, Hongkar North, McPherson, Punggol West, and introduced Bukit Gombak, Jalan Kayu, Jurong Central, Queenstown, Sembawang West, and Tampines Changkat. We've also introduced 5 new GRCs. We have Pasir Ris Changi, Punggol, Jurong East Bukit Batok, Marine Parade Braddell Heights, West Coast Jurong West. Yeah, quite a mouthful. The white paper does acknowledge this and says that the use of double-barreled names is to better reflect the identities of the geographical areas in the GRCs. And if you've seen my previous video talking about compactness metrics to determine the fairness of electoral boundaries, you might have seen that the Marine Parade GRC from the previous election scored particularly poorly. Something like a name change just to address the identity of these GRCs doesn't necessarily address these fairness considerations. These are the newly computed Polsby-Popper scores for the current electoral boundaries. If you want to see the 2021s, they're in a previous video. Again, you can see quite a few GRCs perform quite poorly on these compactness scores, like the Pasir Ris Changi GRC, for example, or the Marine Parade Braddell Heights GRC, or Jalan Besar GRC. And while the SMCs actually perform quite well in these compactness tests, one thing that we should also look out for is how many other districts surround the SMC. A district such as Sembawang West, for example, we should be asking ourselves why we have an SMC embedded within a GRC. Some of you have asked if there's an absolute threshold that we can set for these compactness metrics to determine whether our election boundaries are fair or not. This would be very difficult to implement in practice because these scores are quite arbitrary. For example, in the Polsby-Popper case, if you give me a very high resolution map with a lot of detail on the borders, I would be measuring a much higher perimeter compared to a lower resolution map. Mathematically, this is related to an infinite perimeter object called fractals. If you're interested, go look it up. It's very cool. Even so, this is a very useful metric because it provides us with a concrete and robust way of comparing our different districts. Furthermore, in this original Polsby-Popper paper, they go into more detail about how compactness metrics can be used to safeguard democracy against partisan gerrymandering. Of course, in this white paper, they did go into more detail about why they've proposed these changes to the GRCs, the main one being population shifts and housing developments. One of the examples mentioned was the population increase in Potong Pasir SMC because of the BTOs in Bidadari. Similarly, because of all the new BTO housing developments in Punggol area, they're getting a new GRC taken from the previous Pasir Ris Punggol GRC and Punggol West SMC. And here it's been reported that the average size of GRCs, proportion of MPs elected from SMCs, and average ratios of electors to elected MPs has been maintained. Now, just like the analysis I introduced earlier on compactness, these individual metrics are quite one-dimensional. As evident in this current election, it's obvious that if we're trying so hard to keep these metrics, it comes at the cost of changing a lot of electoral boundaries. And this could prove detrimental to several parties, the primary one being us as constituents. And this goes beyond the hassle of just trying to figure out which election district you're in which election cycle. If you're moving populations across electoral boundaries during these cycles, what you're doing is eroding the trust that the constituents are building and have been building with their elected MPs, no matter their party. So in this video, I've already touched on a few things that could improve the election experience. And what I hope to see from the EBRC in the future is to build on their primary focus. For example, looking into boundary fairness or trying to minimize the changes that you're introducing to the electoral boundaries from cycle to cycle. Especially with the current system that we have in place, it certainly feels like an own-self check oneself kind of thing, right? It is extra critical in this case to be as transparent as possible to build the trust the population has in the system. As we've hopefully deduced by this point in the video, elections are a very, very complex and multifaceted process. And it's not something that you can necessarily find the right answer for, especially with limited metrics like we've seen. But yeah, some food for thought, some extra considerations. What do you think about these new electoral boundaries? Again, thanks for watching. All the information I got for this video was from the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee White Paper 2025. Do all of our votes have the same value? In the recently released EBRC white paper, we see that one of their main focuses was maintaining the number of electors per MP. This is very important in a democracy to ensure that everybody's voice is equally heard, even with population changes and shifts in the country. And here they've reported that with the new 2025 proposed electoral boundaries, they've managed to maintain about 28,384 electors per MP. If you made it through Sec 3 math, you should know that statistics is not just about averages or means. Paying attention to other factors like the broader distribution could also tell us more about how each individual district performs relative to this average. So as you can see in the histogram plotted here, we have all of these different districts and how many of them correspond to a certain number of voters per MP. So the average we've identified here is exactly the same as the one reported in the EBRC report. But at first glance, we can already tell that this is not a very even distribution. It's bimodal with neither of the modes corresponding to the mean. So you can see that while this average of 28,000 voters per MP is maintained, actually not that many districts match this value closely. And if you pay attention to the range on the x-axis, you can see that we range from 22,000 all the way to over 33,000 voters per MP. So what does this mean? So if you are in one of these districts here with fewer voters per MP, that means there's fewer of you sharing that MP and your voice will be heard more. On the other side of the spectrum, if there's almost 33,000 of you sharing one MP, it is less likely that your individual voice is going to be heard or represented. And this is the reason why we are and should be so focused on this voter-MP ratio. For this election, if you're from Kebun Baru, Marymount, or Mountbatten, lucky you. On the other hand, if you're from West Coast Jurong, Ang Mo Kio, or Bukit Panjang, it might feel a little bit crowded. If you're also interested, we have the standard deviations computed and they're around 3,000. But what's most striking to me personally was looking at the district with the most number of voters per MP and the district with the least number of voters per MP. So Bukit Panjang and Kebun Baru. I mean, I'm no mathematician, but 33,000 and 22,000, I think that's a 51% difference. For a committee whose main job is to maintain the average ratio of electors to elected MPs, I think we can expect a little bit better of them. Let's look at another extreme case, which is the 5 MP GRC with the fewest number of voters, Marine Parade Braddell Heights, and the 4 MP GRC with the greatest number of voters, which is Sengkang. Marine Parade Braddell Heights has 131,000 voters and Sengkang has 126,000. So with a mere difference of 500 voters, this is translated to a full 1 extra MP in Parliament. In fact, if we took the number of voters in Marine Parade Braddell Heights GRC and gave them 4 MPs instead, the ratio of voters to elected MPs would still be within this range, at around 32,800, so on the upper end. Similarly for Sengkang, if we took the same number of voters and gave them 5 MPs instead, it would still fall within this accepted range here at around 25,000. So what we should really expect from this distribution is something that is narrower so that it is unambiguous how many MPs you're going to assign to a district with a certain voter size. Like in the example I gave, the 2 districts, Sengkang and Marine Parade Braddell Heights, could very reasonably have either 4 or 5 MPs. Having such a big range allows the ambiguity between 4 or 5 MPs to exist and does make the decision of 4 or 5 quite arbitrary. I mean, of course, due to urban planning, the shapes of our actual residential districts, we can't expect all the districts to be exactly at this mean of 28,000. So ideally, the distribution we want to aim for is to have a greater concentration of districts around this mean and then a smaller concentration of districts along the 2 sides. A shape like this is called a Gaussian, but given that a chief statistician is on the EBRC board, I think you guys should know this already.
That you have all these accusations, but there have never really been any evidence,
Okay, bet, let's go. Let me present you with 3 pieces of evidence today. Firstly, let's look at how well the EBRC actually did in terms of maintaining the elector to MP ratio in all of the districts. This is one of their primary roles laid out in their white paper. You can see behind me, I've plotted the distribution of elector to MP ratios. And we verified the number reported in the EBRC white report for the mean that they've maintained, which is 28,384. What they did not report, however, is the spread of their distributions, which is what I've plotted here for us to visualize. And as we can see, this distribution is not very symmetrical, not very even, and not concentrated around the mean. This range is incredibly broad, ranging from 22,000 around this end to 33,000 on that end. That's a 50% difference between the district with the smallest elector MP ratio to the district with the largest elector MP ratio. So in terms of ensuring that every single individual's vote has the same value, quite a sloppy job was done here. Personally, the most eye-opening example for me was comparing Marine Parade Brattle Heights GRC as well as Sengkang GRC. Because of the breadth of this distribution, it's very ambiguous whether Sengkang and Marine Parade Brattle Heights GRC should be given 4 or 5 MPs. If you gave either of those GRCs either of those number of MPs, it would still be within this allowed range here. And this leaves the decision between 4 and 5 MP up to the board's discretion, and the process behind this is not reported in the white paper. And just for extra context, if I plot all of these districts out with their elector MP ratios, we see some trends start to appear. For example, all 3 districts that were opposition won in the 2020 election have higher than average elector to MP ratios. And that's not a good thing because constituents would have to share the resources of the one MP as well as the parliamentary vote of that one MP across more of them. And now instead of looking at just the win-loss outcomes, we also look at the vote share of the ruling party. And we can see that there's a greater concentration of better performing districts on this lower end of the spectrum. And we see that the opposite is the case for districts that have historically lower vote shares by the ruling party. I've elaborated a lot more on this in my previous video, but we don't really have enough data points to make any statistically significant conclusions about any ill intention or ill will behind the distribution of these districts. However, as we've seen in just the examples I've raised today, this does suggest that there might be some sloppy work at play, or maybe even some arbitrary decision-making that is not properly elucidated in the EBRC white paper. Okay, now the second thing. Another way we can gain some insight into whether there's partisan bias at play in the drawing of electoral districts is looking at something called partisan symmetry. So there's 2 ways that you can measure the electoral performance of your party. The first one being the popular vote, so how many people out of the entire nation voted for you. On the other hand, the one that's more meaningful in practice is how many seats you actually win in parliament. And ideally, you want both of these numbers to be pretty similar so that your parliament can properly represent the voices of the citizens of the country. If there's a big discrepancy between these numbers, it certainly does call for some thorough investigation, although it doesn't immediately mean that there are sinister forces at play. Thirdly, we can think about the compactness of our electoral districts. I've gone into more detail about this in my previous video, but essentially we want our electoral districts to be compact. If they have some spatial biases like that, and this is the Marine Parade Brattle Heights GRC as an example, it does suggest that there might be some other factors at play. It begs the question, for example, why is this wing up here? Why is there this part sticking out and this all the way at the bottom? And none of these spatial factors are touched on in the white paper because the main focus is maintaining the elector to MP ratio, which, as we've seen earlier in the video, isn't that well maintained anyways. So one very common metric in the political sciences to quantify the compactness of your electoral districts is something called the Polsby-Popper score. I've gone into more detail about this in a previous video, so you can check that out if you're interested. Essentially, you get a higher score if your district is more compact, more spatially unbiased, and you get a lower score if your district has random parts jutting out like the examples above. This score is computed using the area and the perimeter of the district. I've computed the Polsby-Popper scores for all of our electoral districts for 2025 up here on the screen. And what we see is a pretty poor performance across all of these districts, with many of them scoring under 0.5. Marine Parade Brattle Heights, for example, all the way down there scores at 0.25 out of 1. And here I've presented the exact same data but visualized across the entire map of Singapore. Usually we have these smaller districts, these SMCs, that score better on compactness, whereas the larger GRCs, Jalan Besar, Marine Parade, for example, that score particularly poorly. The lowest scores are in East and West Coast, but given the shape of the country, it is quite difficult to make a compact district with those shapes. And before I end off, I want to acknowledge that many of the comments critiquing my analysis has told me that the different shapes of the electoral districts, the different elector to MP ratios, might be because of different factors like socioeconomic status or even racial reasons. And Eugene, I want to bring up your own publication from 2005, where you explored how the effectiveness of electoral and spatial integration is actually undermined by the ruling party's focus on ensuring the continued dominance of the ruling party. The main takeaway from this video is that there is a lot of concrete evidence that there is opacity in our electoral system, and calls for greater transparency surrounding this electoral process is only going to increase the citizens' trust in this electoral system. Whether this is through establishing a more independent board or maybe expecting a lengthier EBRC white paper if they introduce sweeping changes like they have done in this 2025 cycle. I think we should be past this era of dismissing citizens' concerns as baseless or as just anti-PAP. At the end of the day, all of us benefit from free and fair elections. Thanks for sticking through the whole video. These are my references for today.